Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. This is your host, good people, Chris Coppola, and I am joined today by the man you cannot see. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, Mr. Dylan Holzman?
Hello, everyone. It's the man with a face for radio, back again for another episode.
And so we came up with an idea here. This is actually based off a book. Is that correct? The title of a book.
Yeah, so we've made reference to various forks that we've done over the last couple of years from a book by Phil Mason called Napoleon's Hemorrhoids. But we've been kind of holding off on doing the actual fork that gave the book its name, and we are going to change that today. So we're going to talk today, ladies and gentlemen, about Napoleon's Hemorrhoids, which some of you may not have known was a thing. But here's how it goes. This all centers around the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. So quick recap. Napoleon, French Revolution. He's a captain, shoots grape shot into the crowd, does some things. French Revolution gets crazy. Napoleon takes over. Napoleon goes crazy, goes to Egypt, goes to Russia, loses, beats five coalitions, loses to the sixth, gets exiled to Elba, and then decides to come back because apparently he's not done. So in March...
By the way, just correct me if I'm wrong. I'm trying to do the math on this. He beat probably six. You said six. He beat four of those coalitions with these hemorrhoids, right?
Yeah. So Napoleon had hemorrhoids basically for about 15 years, since basically 1800-ish. So he comes back in March of 1815, begins what's known as the 100 Days. No, it's not named after FDR. It's basically the 100 days he was in power until he loses at Waterloo and basically finally gets retired for good the second time. The Empire struck back. There will be no revenge of the French. So what happens in our timeline, though, is there's this weird kind of...
I want to know which empire struck back, but the
French Empire struck back.
Okay.
Because that's the second movie.
The Russian Empire struck back, as did the Austrian, as did the British. Yeah.
Look, as long as we can agree that the last Corsican is the end of the saga.
I want Bernadette to be Jar Jar somehow.
I was about to do a Jar Jar Binks impression, and I held myself off at the last minute. So in our timeline, Waterloo has a couple of weird things that are very un-Napoleon. When the day starts, so it rained very heavily the night before. Napoleon, traditionally in his battles, he's kind of a very hard-charging, he's innovative, he's aggressive when it comes to campaigning. He's strategic, but he likes to go on the attack. So normally Napoleon starts pretty early in the morning with his battles, But in this battle, for some reason, Napoleon waits until like 1 o'clock in the afternoon before he gets started. Meanwhile, the Duke of Wellington, who's commanding most of the coalition forces, with the exception of the Prussians, who are going to come in a little bit later, Wellington's got his guys like getting ready and going at like 6 a.m. They're Englishmen. They don't care about rain. It rains 378 days a year in England. So, they're not bothered. But basically Napoleon gets this late start. And there's also reports of him, his brother reported that he fell asleep at the breakfast table after he ate breakfast. He was giving some kind of vague, confusing orders all morning. And what this means is, the long and the short of it is, Napoleon gets a late start to the battle. And he sent one of his commanders, Ney, to go basically lead a cavalry attack to kind of delay and harass the Prussians, who were nearby, but were not in the direct engagement yet. Because his plan is he was going to delay the Prussians, focus on Wellington, bibbity bobbity boop, take out one guy, then focus on the other. But what happens is because of this late start, Ney is not able to completely delay the Prussians. And because of this late start, when Napoleon finally goes after Wellington, it's a very close fought battle. Even Wellington even said of the actual Battle of Waterloo, he said something along the lines of it was the nearest fought thing you ever saw, meaning they barely snuck out with a victory. But
part of that is also Wellington wanting to make it sound that much
more impressive that he beat Napoleon.
Yeah, he knew how to tell himself a story.
Exactly. But so basically what I'm getting at is Napoleon kind of stumbles into this fight, for lack of a better description, and ends up having to fight first the British and then also the Prussians at once. And as a result, the combined armies of the coalition end up beating Napoleon. And this is what really basically cinches his downfall. And he gets kicked out a couple days later. He abdicates. In our timeline, we're going to rewind a couple of days before this. So like I said, Napoleon had hemorrhoids for about 15 years now. Incredibly painful. It's kind of a marvel he managed to do all the stuff he did do with these hemorrhoids, because from what I hear, they were just miserably painful. But his doctors would treat.
And also, again, this is kind of like what you mentioned Napoleon's known for being aggressive. One of the other things he's very, very big on is being very hands-on and adapting to the situation in the battlefield, which means in this time frame, riding around on a horse, seeing the battle, that can't be comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the treatment that his physicians would really do is they would essentially leech the boils, like you see in some medieval depictions and stuff. Oh, we got to balance your humors. We're going to let the leeches suck your blood, blah, blah, blah. That's actually modern medical sciences, obviously it's not the ideal treatment for a hemorrhoid, but if that's all you have, that's actually not that bad of a treatment, because the leeches do suck out a lot of the blood, a lot of the pus, a lot of the seepage from, the particular kind of hemorrhoids that he had. Unfortunately for Napoleon, his doctors lose the leeches 2 days before the battle. They just don't know where they are. Forgot to pack them. Don't know what happened to them. They ran off into the sunset to go have a leech marriage or whatever. So as a result, because Napoleon can't get leeched, his doctors.
By the way, Dylan, I'm saying this right now. You've mentioned a couple of times you have a band. Leech Marriage as a band name.
It's the name of my post-punk band.
Make that happen.
So as a result of not having these leeches, Napoleon's doctors instead decide to go one step up from homeopathic medicine and go straight to opiates. They give him laudanum, which is, it's kind of an opiate derivative. You hear milk of the poppy that George R.R. Martin talks about in Game of Thrones. That's basically what laudanum is. It's basically just liquefied opiate that you drink and you get basically cracked out on it. If you want to see kind of a good perception of what people are like when they're on opium, and this is going to be a weird left turn, but bear with me. Watch Tombstone, the Kurt Russell movie about Wyatt Earp, because his wife in that movie is a laudanum addict, and she just lays around in bed all day and can't do anything. That's kind of what this does. It just wonks you out. You can't focus. You sleep. You're basically numb to the world because it's an opiate. So Napoleon is still feeling the effects, supposedly, of this dose of laudanum that they gave him. Because you got to remember, this is probably one of the first times in a long while he's had laudanum. So he's got no tolerance to it. So it's thrown him for a loop. He wakes up on the morning of the battle. He eats breakfast. His brother reports that he falls back asleep at the breakfast table. He's giving all these orders that aren't super specific, aren't very clear. And the theory goes, at least according to Phil Mason's book, that is why Napoleon got his late start, because he's zonked out all morning on opium. Even though he's awake, he's not really there. And that is what causes the delay.
And then
that ends up losing the battle.
Talk a little bit about, once he does get started, what does he do? What is like the first half the battle, as far as the French are concerned, is he fixates on this farmhouse called Hougoumont, and basically it doesn't affect much, but he just wants to take it.
It's like the Stalingrad of Waterloo.
And he just throws his army against it rather than actually fighting Wellington's army.
Yeah. So our fork basically, and as a result of this, that delay, that force of trying to just hammer this one random spot, part of that delay is what allows Blücher, who is the Prussian general, to basically fend off this cavalry sort of dilatory attack that was supposed to keep him out of the fight
And
and come
also
in.
Napoleon doesn't know he's coming.
Exactly.
He doesn't know, like, there's a clock ticking on me.
Yeah. So in our timeline, what we're going to say is the physicians don't lose the leeches. So that morning, the morning of Waterloo, Napoleon wakes up, gets his hemorrhoids taken care of. I was going to say something, off the cuff, but I decided not to. I want to keep it PG. Um, Napoleon gets his hemorrhoids taken care of with the leeches. He decides, all right, I'm up, I'm ready. He's up by 5 or 6. This tells the soldiers to get ready. They're ready to start rocking and rolling by like 8:30. So that is what we're going to say is when the battle starts. And more importantly, he actually immediately, as soon as he gets up, tells Ney, hey, here's exactly the plan. You're going to go to, distract Blücher, keep him off our backs, go now while they're still far away because they're marching to the battle. We're going to take care of Wellington and we're going to wheel around. And once we've beaten Wellington, take care of Blücher. So in this timeline with a clear-headed Napoleon, that's basically exactly what happens. He attacks earlier in the day. He's got more time to finish off Wellington before the Prussians arrive, so that by the time they do, he's beaten off Wellington and he can turn around and end up taking care of Blücher, and he essentially wins the Battle of Waterloo. So that's kind of the basic setup. So with Napoleon victorious, clear-headed, no laudanum, having beaten the Duke of Wellington and General Blücher, he is now kind of secure. Chris, don't you think that's the best way to say it?
So there's no foreign armies marching on him, I guess is the first way to put it.
That's kind of what I meant by kind of.
Yeah. Now, we talked. What is he going to? What is his first priority after there's nobody literally trying to kill me right now?
Yeah. So I think, and you have to remember, this is a Napoleon we're talking about. We had the discussion of, okay, is he going to go back to being 1812 Napoleon, where he's trying to basically rampage all over Europe? Or is he going to try and get his house in order? Because you have to remember, he has just come back from exile, has basically completely usurped control of the French government. Not even completely yet, because, there's still large parts of the existent French government that don't really like Napoleon being around. So our theory is that rather than go back to sort of stereotypical world conquest Napoleon, after having already had to run back from Russia in 1812 to deal with problems at home, he's going to realize, hey, I can't just go wandering around fighting armies all the time. At this point, I have to go back and make sure that I actually control something so that I can feed my armies, so that if I want to go out later, I will have an army. So our proposition is that he goes back to Paris and basically solidifies control. Whether that's immediately dissolving some of the legislative assemblies and the establishments, or just kind of co-opting them and taking more control. Our position is that he's going to focus on taking control of basically the kind of extant borders of France, and he's going to realize that since he just beat the Prussians and the British kind of coalition army, he can probably try to buy some time to get his house in order. So what we're proposing is actually Napoleon, after this victory at Waterloo, he's a little bit older, he's a little bit more experienced with the dangers of overconfidence on the home front. We're going to say he actually plays the long game by not playing the short game. And he actually decides to at least try to sue for either peace or a ceasefire or some kind of détente, acknowledging that, hey, you're right. Got a little out of my britches last time, went a little crazy. Sorry, guys. Basically making overtures to the British and the Prussians and the rest of the coalition members. Saying,
by the way, I think the most important is the Russians.
Yes.
It's super interesting. I just got done watching a really interesting documentary on like the Congress of Vienna.
Mhm.
And I think the important thing to think about is people don't like how crazy Alexander seemed to Alexander, the Tsar of Russia,
Mhm. Yeah.
seemed to a lot of these people. And he actually came in. He was the one who, don't forget, like prior to the invasion, Alexander and Napoleon were buddies. Alexander was participating in the continental system. And he actually kind of pushed the victorious Seventh Coalition to even give Napoleon Elba, to call him Emperor of Elba. So there's still a little bit of friendship there.
Yeah, there's a weird will they won't they kind of thing going on with the Russians.
And there's also, from the perspective of the British and the Austrians, and the Prussians, a fear of what an unpredictable Russia is going to do, and a willingness. The amazing thing about even our timelines, Congress of Vienna, is France is not only represented in the meetings, France plays a role in the meetings. It's nowhere near like what happens at Versailles, where the Germans are just slid a document and told to sign.
Yeah.
The French, Talleyrand there is a deal maker. And I think Talleyrand flip-flops so much.
Yeah.
Before John Kerry, there was...
I was going to make that joke. And the other interesting thing about these peace negotiations, if you have Napoleon at the table, is...
I do feel like we might need to explain to some other members of the podcast who John Kerry is and what that joke...
They were alive when when that happened, but we'll have to talk to him about it. But the other interesting thing is, if you have a Napoleon who has consolidated power as the king of, or emperor of whatever he wants to call himself.
Yeah, let's talk about that later.
We'll talk about that in a second. But if he's in power, you know who now has a more vested interest in what happens with the political structure of France? Austria. Because guess who Napoleon's second wife is? The daughter of the Emperor of Austria.
His second wife and the mother
of his sole legitimate heir.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think that at least lays a feasible groundwork for some sort of Congress of Vienna type discussion that allows Napoleon to stay in power in France. The interesting thing that does, one...
Well, let's pause and settle.
That's
what is he allowed to call himself?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that they will enforce is, we will let you stay in power in France, but you are just going to be the king of France, or go back to consul, whatever the hell you want to call yourself. But basically, you're not going to be an emperor because you only have the one kingdom. And as everyone knows, according to Crusader Kings medieval rules, you cannot be an emperor unless you have more than one king you can boss around, or one kingdom that you control. So because he's limited to the sort of historic borders of France, not the natural borders of France, just the historic borders of France, he is the new king of France. Now, the other interesting thing that does is he does still have some family kicking around. Most importantly, his brother Joseph, who in our timeline, he starts off in southern Italy, and then he gets, bounces over to Spain to do Spanish stuff. But he retains the hereditary title to Naples and southern Italy that Napoleon gives him, even while he's off doing Spanish stuff. So he can go back to Naples. There's not going to be a Bourbon that's forced into the Neapolitan throne, because
which there was in our timeline.
Because
Joseph played footsie during the 100 Days.
Exactly. But with his brother back in power in France, he's safe and secure. So there's another Bonaparte, and actually Italian Bonaparte, in southern Italy.
Good boy.
Chris and I had some very funny discussions about our respective heritages before we started recording, just so y'all know. So that kind of lays the groundwork, and that in itself is kind of interesting. But the really interesting thing is what that does for knock-on effects for, later in the 1800s. Because to be honest, so just to fast forward a little bit, in our timeline, Napoleon dies in Elba in, I think, 1821. No, St. Helena, not Elba. He dies in 1821, and it's discovered that he has advanced stomach cancer. So in this timeline, Napoleon maybe lives a couple of years longer because he did endure, at least what he argued, were some pretty rough conditions in the various stops that he was housed and imprisoned.
The British fed him.
They did feed him. What they fed him may be up for debate.
British food.
Yeah, true. Fair point. But even if Napoleon is back in Paris eating, French food that has spices and things in it, he's probably not going to make it past an extra couple of years. So maybe max 1823, 24. Either way, he's out of the picture by the mid 1820s, I think. However, with a Napoleon in France, he has solidified his succession to, and I'm going to read his name to you because I have to do that because that's just kind of how I am. Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte, who takes the regnal name of Napoleon II. This is Napoleon's son, who in our timeline only lived to the early 1830s himself. He died at the age of 21 or 22 because he had tuberculosis after he caught pneumonia. This is back in the day when anytime you got sick and you had a cough, if it went past a certain point of severity, everybody just said you had tuberculosis, whether it was medical tuberculosis or just the quote unquote consumption. Either way, in this timeline with Napoleon II in France, he's when Napoleon dies, he's going to be kind of in his mid-teens. He's not quite going to be the age of majority yet, but he's probably not going to have too much trouble in a regency because the regent would be his mother, who is the daughter of the Austrian emperor, and his regency would be supported by his uncle, who is the king of Naples. So got a few people in his corner. So we can probably safely say that Napoleon II ends up making it to majority in the late 1820s and becoming the second Bonaparte king of France. Now, what I'm going to suggest about this France, as opposed to the France in our timeline under the restored Bourbons, is it probably retains more of some of the ideals of the French Revolution and Napoleon's French Empire, and less of the sort of reactionary, purely autocratic tendencies of the restored Bourbons. Because Napoleon, while he did have obviously some despotic and autocratic tendencies, he did also understand, having, like I said, dealt with the French Revolution. He understood that there were certain things that, one, he kind of believed in some of these ideas, and also from a kind of realpolitik sense, he understood that there are certain things that you could give to the masses without having to necessarily throw away your entire control of the government to get them kind of on your side.
I mean, almost by definition, when you put the Bourbons back in power in France, you are going to attempt to turn the clock back.
Yeah, exactly.
30 years, 1788.
Yeah, exactly.
Napoleon is not doing this.
No. So I think that sets up a really interesting, different French environment. And where that's going is really the next kind of giant curveball that gets thrown around in Europe in the 1800s, which is the revolutions of 1848. Now, the revolutions of 1848 as a concept are kind of commonly understood to kick off with the revolution in France, but that's not actually the first one.
But okay, by the way, we do have to have the joke about which revolution is actually in Les Mis.
Yeah. Yeah. This is that one.
No, it's not.
No, is it 1871?
No, it was the riot. It was rioting in 1832 over the burial of a Napoleonic general. It actually wasn't a successful revolution.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. It's been a long time since I watched Les Mis, you can tell. But yeah, hence the joke. Nobody can remember which revolution it was.
Because it wasn't actually a successful one. And
but
there
this
were
is one
plenty
of
of
the ones-
successful ones.
Yeah. And this is one of the ones that people think of as the French Revolution in 1848. But that's not actually the first one. The first one that kind of really instigated the French one is the revolution against a different then Bourbon monarch. Now it would be a Bonaparte monarch.
Except it probably wouldn't happen, or would happen.
Well, that's kind of where I was going. But basically, this is a different Naples and two Sicilies that this first revolution would kick off in. So we don't actually know that it would kick off because, again, you've got a Bonaparte who is going to probably steal some things from his brother's French kingdom in terms of the governance and stuff. And kind of along the same lines, sort of head off at least some of what the revolutions of 1848 started about. Obviously they transformed into kind of these big questions of nationalism and liberalism and things like that. But some of the germ of all those problems were from some of these reactionary, revanchist rollbacks to try and reset the clock to the 1780s, which we don't have. So there may be some unrest, but I think, under a sort of Bonapartist school of monarchy, the revolutions may, or the unrest may happen, but they don't turn into full-fledged revolutions. They may just kind of turn into disparate sort of discrete protests.
What I don't think is, because remembering one of the outcomes of the Congress of Vienna of the Holy Alliance, basically the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians actively stand up and start saying, like, if you start speaking liberal, we invade you. They do it in Spain. They do it in a couple of other places. In 1848, the Russian army marches into Hungary and kind of, for the lack of a better phrase, pulls a Habsburg schnitzel out of the fire. Oh,
we're really pushing that PG rating here.
That is the German equivalent of bacon.
Yeah.
Well, they pull bacon out of the fire.
So the other interesting thing that 1848 comes in is, and this is especially prevalent since we have a Bonaparte in Italy, is this is the beginnings of the kind of Risorgimento that leads to eventually, long time, decades down the road, after several unsuccessful attempts, the creation of the Kingdom of Italy. Well, there's one thing that this timeline and the normal timeline where Italy was formed in, 1871, 1869?
So it was formed.
It was like 66, I think, right?
It's really interesting because there's a parallel every time there's two series of wars in our timeline. One was in 1866, one was 1871. And in 1866, basically, the Austrians are busy having their teeth kicked in. So the Italians allied with the French and can actually take northern Italy. And that is kind of the foundation of what is modern Italy. But then 1871, when the French get their teeth kicked in, the Italians take Rome from the Pope. And that is kind of so it's kind of in 66 is when, like, the territory, when an entity you're going to recognize as Italy is formed on a map.
Yeah.
Because Rome is just,
it's its own kind of weird thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, what I was getting to is, so in our timeline and this new timeline, there is one thing in common in both sort of Italian peninsulas. There is a Giuseppe. In our timeline, it's Giuseppe Garibaldi. In this timeline, and before to spoil things, Chris, you know what the Italian, this may be a rhetorical question, but do you know what the Italian version of the name Joseph is?
Giuseppe.
So Giuseppe Bonaparte.
No.
Okay.
Giuseppe Bonaparte.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
If we're doing one,
Giuseppe
we're
Bonaparte.
doing
Sorry, you're right. Giuseppe de Bonaparte. So basically, we have a Giuseppe in this timeline.
I do feel like I do want to say this might need to be a video episode just so you can see how wildly my hands are waving when I say these things.
You're living up to your ancestry big there, bud. So basically the idea that I'm hinting at is, you can very much see that, especially with, a relative on the French throne, more relatives on the Austrian throne. Joseph Bonaparte, actually it'd be Joseph's successor, who we kind of think would be. Joseph only had daughters, but one of his daughters actually married back into one of Napoleon's other brother's son, Charles Lucien. So basically what we're saying is there's going to be a Bonaparte. They're going to still be in the family. Long story short, you have French support. You have
actually, you know what I think. And by the way, please understand, I'm going to throw this at him, at Dylan. He doesn't know this is coming yet. If Joseph doesn't have a son, maybe they do the cousin jump to the child of Louise Bonaparte, or Louis Bonaparte, who in our timeline is known as Napoleon III of France.
Oh, okay. I like that. I like that. Either way, they're because remember, they're now by marriage related to the Habsburgs. They're gonna steal a page from their book. But what I'm getting at is this.
Who, by the way, Napoleon III, instrumental in allying with Piedmont Savoy in our timeline and making Italy a thing.
Yeah. So basically what we're kind of setting up is, instead of Piedmont Savoy, it's just going to be a switch where the Neapolitans become the primary facilitator of Italian unification.
Or the Corsicans.
Yeah, the Corsicans.
The Corsicans in charge of Neapolitans.
Well, the Corsicans are kind of the link here, but basically it's coming from the south. And more importantly, with, Piedmont Savoy in 1848, one of the things that kind of screwed them over is they declared war on Austria. You know what a Neapolitan Bonaparte, who's related to the Habsburgs, doesn't have to do? Declare war on Austria. So there may be, probably not in 1848 directly, but it's entirely possible that you may see a at least mostly unified Italy, with the carve out of Rome, obviously, in kind of the mid 1850s. I think that's entirely possible. And the way we got around, we kind of talked about the sort of conflict in sort of northeastern Italy, because this is territory that's under the Habsburg Empire, but kind of is a natural part of the Italian peninsula. In order, in exchange for recognition of Italy, Giuseppe, Joseph, his kids, whoever, accede parts of that to the Austrians and also offer to recognize them as kind of the natural overlords of quote unquote Germany, which is still a vague foreign concept at this time.
In other words, just to be clear, northeastern modern Italy is acceded to the Neapolitan Italian state for Austrian suzerainty over southern Germany.
Maybe not all of it, but certainly parts of it.
Because again, these are still nominally independent states. So you put a Habsburg in charge of it, suzerainty. This is all Crusaders Kings kind of title.
Yeah, this is much more medieval concepts than modern nation state concepts. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. They use the Austrians in exchange for conceding and recognizing the kingdom of Italy. Italy will then turn around and support Austrian ambitions in Germany, because that's the big conflict.
France. That's the other,
and that's the other tie-in.
Basically, we haven't talked about them yet. There's a power that I kind of talk about a lot, Prussia, who kind of wants to unify Germany, but is going to be confronted with a fait accompli here, where it's the Austrians may not be that happy about it, but they'll accede to it. Then the Italians and the French. So nobody is going, assuming it's Bismarck. Bismarck is going to look at this and say, I don't have any friends.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot fight this.
Yeah. So I think Bismarck is going to be forced, instead of trying to go south and, the ideal for Bismarck, if he could get it, was always Großdeutschland with, Austria and the rest of Germany.
Mhm.
But if he can't even get the rest of Germany, he's going to say, all right, let me see where else I can go. And so I think the interesting thing that comes out of this sort of French, Italian, Austrian kind of alliance or rapprochement is Bismarck's going to look around. Prussia is on the Baltic Sea and kind of the North Sea with some of the other German territories. Well, the English are right across the North Sea. You've got kind of the trading cities of what used to be the Hanseatic League kind of on the North Sea coast in, Germany, now parts of the Netherlands, Denmark. You've also got with this French, Italian, Austrian alliance, you've got Russia, who's Russia's always looking for trade, especially when your ports are frozen half of the time. So if they see a chance at getting some trade in the Baltic, they're going to take it. But also, like you talked about earlier, this kind of will they, won't they with France and sort of nobody knowing what Russia's going to do. Well, at this time, Russia's other primary historic enemy is Austria. Russia is going to look at Austria, Italy, France, who they used to be friends with, all kind of buddying up. And they're going to say, okay, I don't think I can trust these guys to if I just leave myself alone and kind of hide in my corner. I need to find friends. So where I'm going with all this is I suspect Bismarck's attention is going to turn instead to the North Sea and start to try and work, maybe initially as some kind of trading alliance, but start to eventually unify some of the kind of northern German disparate principalities, maybe Schleswig and Holstein, maybe even Denmark, with some support and growing collegiality between them, England, Britain, whatever you want to call it, and Russia. So that is kind of an interesting counterpunch to what's becoming kind of this Catholic alliance of France, Italy, and Austria is this sort of kind of Northern Sea Baltic League kind of deal. And I suspect there's not going to be a whole lot that happens initially other than Bismarck making moves. I can totally see him, especially if he can get Russia and Britain on his side.
That's the thing. I'm not sure he can. I think Russia and Britain, because of Central Asia, are never going to be okay with each other. But I think Bismarck can play,
I think he can play the middleman.
Can play the cracks there, yeah.
Yeah. And I think what his goal mainly is going to be with all this is obviously, trade, economics, all that. But I think he's going to try and unify as much of the northern German states as he can. And I think in our timeline, one of the things that Bismarck did to really initially unify the North German Federation was to arguably invade. I would call it an invasion. Call it what you will. Schleswig and Holstein, one of which was under a personal union with the Crown of Denmark. In this timeline, I think Bismarck, as clever as he is, can at least get some concessions to stay out from Britain if he decides he wants to go in after not just Schleswig and Holstein, but Denmark proper.
Mm-hmm.
Because he did all these wranglings of Holstein has this independence referendum, and then Denmark's like, no, you won't. And then he's like, okay, we're going to go in to protect them. And that's basically how he gets it. But, Bismarck, like we learned in the Franco-Prussian War in our timeline, not afraid to kind of make other people look like the bad guy to get him in a favorable position. I can very much see him pulling a similar scheme against the King of Denmark to allow the Prussians to essentially take the whole of the Jutland Peninsula, let's say.
Yes. Maybe not the islands.
No, but the mainland. Yeah.
Right.
So I think that sets up kind of an interesting counterpoint. But really, I think that's probably the most that happens kind of in German response, at least initially, to this sort of new power play kind of dynamic. However, there is another conflict that's bubbling a little further east, specifically in the Black Sea. that is going to kind of throw some of this for a loop. And I know, Chris, you had some thoughts on what might happen with that in the 1860s.
So you know, I'm quibbling over you use the one word that I would be okay with you using, which is the Black Sea. Because we're talking now about what in our timeline was the Crimean War, which is only known as a Crimean War because that's where Britain and France invaded. Maybe it should be called the First Crimean War.
Yeah, I would probably say so.
Then again, I also am going to make the argument that the 100 Days might need to be called the First Opium War. Anyway, basically, this is another of those, Russian things. They go to war with the Ottoman Empire. They beat them pretty handily. And in our timeline, Britain and France kind of, in a real break from their historic positions, team up to go in and stop the Russians from just completely looting the Ottoman Empire. And that, when you're Britain, you invade on the coast. What's more coastal than a peninsula? So that's kind of why in our mind it's actually called the Crimean War, because that's where the British and French could actually get to them. They also fight in the Far East and a couple of other places, but that's what it's known as. In this timeline, where Britain and France are not necessarily close to each other, which again was a big departure. It's an interesting argument to think what happens to Russia. Are they able to consolidate their gains against the Ottomans because they don't face a united rest of Europe, which they kind of did? What do you think happens, Dylan, in terms of how does this alliance system react to that?
So I'm going to say this probably becomes an example of what you would call third-party power politics.
Mm-hmm.
So the Crimean War directly is a conflict between Russia and the Ottomans, because the Ottomans are kind of the
or that's how it starts. It escalates.
Yeah, that's what I meant by directly. Like that's the kernel of it. The Ottomans are a usurper, successor, call it what you want, to the old Byzantines as the sort of second Rome, whereas Russia, Orthodox Christian country, thanks to the Byzantines, has these kind of aspirations as the sort of protector of the Orthodox and the third Rome.
Thanks to the Ukrainians and the Kievan Rus.
Oh yeah, no, trust me, I was going to go there. But so that's the dispute between the Russians and the Ottomans. The Ottomans have one other kind of pernicious, longtime foe, and that is the Austrians. Because let's remember, the only reason we have coffee in the Western world is because the Ottomans, when they were knocking on the gates of Vienna and then had to skedaddle, left their coffee behind. And now I can't get through a day without drinking 20 ounces of the stuff. So the Austrians are going to be very interested, thanks to these old enmities, of what's going on in the Balkans. Because just like the Ottomans and Russia have this thing going on, the Ottomans and Austria have this thing going on over the Balkans, and sort of the protector of, like what sort of created the whole dust up why Serbia was a thing when World War I became a problem is, the protector of the Balkans, that sort of shtick. So we kind of came up with a theory where the Crimean War doesn't actually happen. The Russians kind of start making noises about it. And what happens is the Austrians basically offer their support to the Ottomans in exchange for Ottoman concession, transfer of suzerainty, whatever you want to call it, of Transylvania, which is a historically Hungarian territory. Let's not forget, That's where Dracula comes from. That whole thing comes from a war between sort of the ethnic, sort of Romanian medieval culture groups with Hungarians and Austrians who were coming in to try and take it over. So the Austrians had their eye on Transylvania for a long, long time.
Actually, Dracula fought the Ottomans when they were coming up.
Oh, you're right. No, you're right. It was the other direction. But yeah, it's still the same kind of problem. So we talked about how, the Austrians, for one, kind of take greater suzerainty over southern Germany as sort of the protector of Germans and sort of the natural German kingdom. Well, 1848 is kind of so 1848, to do a bit of a left turn. That's when our timeline. 1848 in our timeline is when the Austrian emperor abdicates in favor of his nephew at the time. I think it was his nephew, Franz Joseph II, because the Austrian emperor at the time was not going to be having any kids. He had like 20 seizures a day. There's speculation that he couldn't even consummate his marriage. It was not great. Again, Habsburgs, cousins, that whole thing. So Franz Joseph becomes emperor by way of a compromise in 1848. There's two things I want to point out about that. One, Franz Joseph, 1848. 1914. He's the emperor in 1914. He's still around. The man will not die. It's the mustache and the sideburns. I'm telling you, they give magic powers. And two, part of how he comes to the throne is the sort of Kaiser and König concept. It's the dual monarchy where the Habsburg emperor is both the emperor of Austria and also separately the king of Hungary. We all are used to thinking of it as one empire, but in fact, it was two completely different polities, legally speaking, politically speaking, that just so happened to have the same monarch and head of state. So in this timeline, with the
if I can pause for a second, kind of coming out of the end of the Holy Roman Empire after losing to Napoleon, the Austrian Empire, kind of pre-48, is trying to keep a single political system, or is trying to expand the imperial power over Hungary. I think the best way to think about this would be kind of almost the United Kingdom of Hungary being Holy Rod. For our listeners, where there's kind of a Scottish system, and in our in Great Britain, that you have the Acts of Union that dissolve these devolved systems, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire has multiple parliaments.
Yeah, and so, we just say Austria-Hungary because those are obviously the two big ones, but there's probably, if I remember my Austro-Hungarian history classes in college, there's like a dozen.
There's a dozen nationalities, and this becomes a thing.
Well, there's also multiple governments. It's not just Austrian and Hungarian, like, political governing bodies. There are some smaller ones in there too. It's just those are the biggest two.
And that's a huge deal. The other thing is, in 1848, the Hungarians are pushing for more of their own special devolved powers against the imperial system. And that's when the Russians come in. And very much, I'm sorry, I loved it, I'm going to say it again, pull Franz Josef Schnitzel out of the fire.
Yeah.
They're why he's in power.
Yeah. Now, in this timeline, with these different revolutions of 1848, I don't know that you would have the same revolutionary sort of kernel of this. Franz Josef, I think, would still be in power because of the inbreeding and infertility problems that the Habsburg family has.
Eventually be in power. I don't know if
by the 1860s, I think he's in power.
Right. And the other thing is, I think what he can do, if there's one thing Habsburgs know how to do, is to acquire territory without actually fighting for it.
So I think, I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, even though it may not be the same formal K&K dual monarchy system, there's going to be an understanding of Franz Josef that he just got all this new German sort of sovereignty, territory, control, indirectly or directly, whatever you want to call it.
Which the Hungarians see as a big threat.
Exactly. So he's going to need to do something kind of akin to the United States' westward expansion, where for a time there was this understanding of, yeah, we kind of have to keep things equal between free and slave states to keep the balance so that this whole thing works. To that end, Franz Josef is going to demand Ottoman ceding of Transylvania in exchange for them backing them up against the Russians, who again, also an enemy of Austria. So for Austria, this is the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. And at least I can get $5 out of my not quite friend while I'm at it. Our argument is that with Austrian and thus implicitly Italian and French, even if it's not necessarily expressed, it's heavily wink, wink, nudge, nudged support behind the Ottomans. The Russians don't try and take Ottoman territory. They back down. Or it stays a narrower conflict.
Well, what by the way happens in, I'm going to say 1878, possibly 79ish. There's another war in this area, and basically what happened multiple times is, and we talked about it in our Russo-Japanese war, which we want to come back to. We promised we would. If somebody wins, and it keeps happening, if somebody wins a war and takes a destabilizing amount of territory, the other European powers, or the European powers, get together and say, no, you actually, even though you won that, and even though you beat up the Ottomans and they told you could have this, you don't actually get to keep it. That happened multiple times. So what I think happens here is that, which is,
it's like a continuation of the Congress system.
And basically the Austrians get Transylvania for free and threaten the Russians into giving up their gains in kind of the Caucasus against the Ottomans.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very plausible, and I think that's a pretty logical way that would play out. So what you kind of start to have happen is, I'm curious, and this is way down the road, so nothing's going to change immediately, but you're kind of building to a French, Italian, Austrian kind of linkage, maybe with at least some involvement periodically with the Ottomans. But this is, and we're going on an hour, so I'm going to save this because I strongly suspect there's going to be a part 2 of this, given that so much of what happens in the 1900s is a direct causal result of all of the stuff that happens really because of Napoleon at the end of the day. So because we're changing what happens with Napoleon, so much afterwards is going to be slightly different or drastically different. But I think this really sets up for an interesting, slightly different, but familiar enough that we kind of can see sort of what's developing, balance of powers between the European sort of great powers heading into the last days of the 1800s. Chris, do you have any final thoughts before we pull this to a close?
Yeah, I have a bomb. I'm going to drop it as I do. One of the outcomes of the Russian defeat in the Crimean War was that Tsar Alexander III realized he needed to end serfdom. He doesn't have that here. He doesn't have the impetus to start all of his reforms, which kind of drag Russia from the best way to understand it. Russia before Alexander III was like a nation that Dylan plays in Crusader Kings. After Alexander III, it was, or at least on the way to becoming, an industrial power that I play in Hearts of Iron. That's the best way to understand.
Yeah, that's pretty much, and it really is. It's that drastic too, which is what's wild about it. But yeah, that's a really interesting thing to point out, especially because that alone is going to have drastic effects on what happens 30, 40 years from now in what's probably going to end up being our part 2. So I have no further thoughts other than, God, who is it? I was just watching The Martian last night, and somebody sings a song called Waterloo. I don't know if it's ABBA or somebody, but basically, whatever that disco song is about Waterloo, we're not going to have it in this timeline.
Mm.
Listeners, you can tell me whoever it is. I don't like disco, so I don't care.
Well, given the rigorous historical training of the majority of disco singers,
It is ABBA. It is ABBA.
By the way, ABBA, who live under, I love bringing everything back together, live under the Jar Jar Binks royal family of Sweden.
How is the Swedish royal family Jar Jar Binks?
Well, it's Bernadotte. We talked about that.
Oh, yeah, true. Yeah, you're right. I missed that connection. Yeah.
Mr. Yahaba servant.
You know what? Yeah, like he does kind of sound like the Swedish chef. I have now exhausted. You know what? You come after my meatballs, I come back hard. Okay, you know what you did.
Apparently, never let an Italian and a Swede get into a food fight is what I'm learning from this episode, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. But given the rigorous historical training of the average disco singer, maybe there is a Waterloo song, because Waterloo happens. It is still a very important battle.
No, they change it to Wellington.
Okay.
Because the syllables match.
Okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've officially jumped the shark, so we're going to call this one to a close. Chris, as we always say on A Fork in Time, if you should happen to come across a fork in time, what should you do?
Give you a piece of advice. Do not lay your bike down on a wet path. That is a bad time. Just to give everyone a heads up. Yeah, this was a fun one. On my way home today, I kind of laid my bike down, kind of took a header. And so I'm coming into this thinking, oh, gee, this is the perfect example of why you shouldn't do things injured. And now, as our sign off, Dylan is going to send me the link so we can play a game of a Paradox game of choice, because he's going to take advantage of this. He knows I'm.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, whatever you do, whatever fork you come across, do not take whatever path Chris apparently took on his bike this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.